Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Josh Taylor. I'm the Senior Director of Professional Development at Shipware. Shipware, we are a cost reduction firm focusing on parcel shipping, third-party fulfillment. We are very happy to be here today. I've got Karamcheti and Paul Yaussy with me, who are both senior consultants. Work directly with our clients to help them optimize their carrier mix, optimize their carrier contracts, and save an average of 15 to 30% sometimes. So we're talking today about the 2024 general rate increase, the impact that it can have on your business, any byproducts that might result from it, any opportunities that you might have, how to mitigate it if possible. We'll spend about the first 30 minutes going through our prepared remarks, but as we're going along, please feel free to type questions down on the bottom, and Audie will be reviewing those as we go. If it's something that's very applicable to what we're talking about, we might interrupt and include that in our discussion. Otherwise, if we don't, we will get to it at the end where we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. So, Paul, Audie, let's get started here. Okay. New year, new base rates, right? If we go back to August of 2023, FedEx announced first that they were coming out with an average of a 5.9% increase, the GRI. Now, this was right after UPS and the Teamsters had announced that they had reached an agreement, and UPS didn't follow FedEx's announcement for a couple of weeks. But when they did, it was the same average, right? It's not the same increase necessarily, but they came out with the same average increase. And we'll get into some of these details, but Paul, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that delay between FedEx announcing and publishing their rates and UPS announcing and then publishing their rates.
Sure, Josh, thanks for asking, and hello, everyone. Just wanted to refresh everyone's memory about the GRI announcements back last fall. FedEx announced on August 29th the 5.9% GRI, and then released the rates a week later on September 7th. Meanwhile, UPS didn't make their announcement until September 7th, and then didn't release the rates all the way until October 12th, which was about 25 or 26 business days since between announcing and releasing their rates. Now, one only can speculate, but that long delay of 25 days between announcing their GRI and releasing the rates, you could speculate that it caught UPS off guard, especially after having come off a long labor negotiation that ended up being fairly costly. It probably caught UPS off guard, and therefore they had to go back and recalibrate before they could release those rates.
Right. Now, I think one of the things that caught UPS off guard especially was probably the ground minimum, right? At 5.9, this isn't the highest rate increase that's ever been announced. It's higher than the average. If you look back over the last 20 years, it's for the most part been around 4.9. But the ground minimum is often going up 8 or 9%. And that's a huge source of yield for the carriers. That's part of what keeps the impact of those increases so high. And that's, FedEx came out basically matching that minimum to their announced increase, which is a big deal. Now, these aren't all in the same order, so you can't really look across and compare them. But, their base rates aren't identical. They are very similar. You see similarly sized increases across the board. But another thing that happened was between publishing what the rates would be and the implementation of those rates, which for UPS came the day after Christmas, a week before FedEx and most of the regionals, they also announced increases to the fuel surcharge tables. And you'll see UPS went up 125 basis points on the ground and 100 basis points on the air. FedEx went up 100 basis points on both. This is essentially an extra percent on top of the GRI. In fact, if you go back to the mid-2000s, the carriers were giving a 6.9% increase and then a 2-point reduction on the fuel table is 200 basis points for a net 4.9. So it is very, very comparable to a full point on the GRI. And that's not included in this 5.9% analysis. In fact, I think most of the people on the call today will understand that surcharges in general are not included in that 5.9, and that mathematically it's very hard to back into that 5.9. So it will impact everybody slightly differently. We also have a couple of the larger regional carriers and international business on the DHL side. OnTrac went up 6.2, but that was essentially to match the UPS base rates almost identically. They also raised the fuel to match the UPS fuel tables. So you do see a slightly different increase depending on how heavy the packages were, and that's just a representation of how different they were from the UPS rates ahead of time. And then finally, the USPS. And Audie, if I could have you comment on this a little bit. The post office has had an interesting year. They've consolidated services, and they handle things differently than everybody else, obviously. So talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, I think one of the first things you'll notice is their rate increase is implemented this week, Monday, effectively. And so one of the things we're seeing is that, and their increase is similar as far as the percentages you're seeing out there, but by implementing them later, there was the opportunity for folks to basically benefit from an arbitrage point of view using UPS, the post office, for the last couple of weeks where their rate increase had not yet been implemented. Again, that requires a certain level of awareness that most folks don't have, or a willingness to diversify, which not a lot of folks feel that they're able to do.
That's an interesting point, right? We'll talk a little bit more in a bit, but with volumes being down, with shippers sending fewer packages, there is excess capacity in the market, and that has affected people's willingness to use carriers other than UPS or FedEx. So let's talk a little bit about how the 5.9 with UPS and FedEx doesn't necessarily represent what you're actually going to pay. Now, Paul wrote a couple of articles that I highly recommend. If you haven't read them, they do get into a lot of the details. The UPS GRI article in Parcel, and FedEx GRI article in Multi-Channel Merchant. So there's more details there if you want to get into it. But we also want to show you some of the more popular surcharges and how much they went up compared to everything else. So this line is the 5.9%. And then we have the surcharges like additional handling and large package surcharge or oversized that go up more than 20%, right? And not only more than 20% this year, but they went up more than 20% last year and the year before that. So this thing really starts to snowball, right? And it's not covered in that GRI at all. So if you're subject to these charges, you've got a big increase on the way, or you've already experienced it. But even some of the ones that touch everybody, like delivery area surcharge and residential surcharge, if you're shipping directly to consumer, these go up significantly more than 5.9%. So, guys, what are your thoughts on some of this?
Well, Josh, I'll jump in briefly and just say, look at our subtitle there. Don't get caught budgeting for only the announced annual GRI. In many cases, shippers who don't have someone on staff that really truly understands parcel, they'll hear the announcement in the fall that both carriers, or all of the carriers, are raising their rates 5.9% and may budget for 5.9% increases, not realizing, as you said, the surcharges are not covered by that announcement. And so if, for example, if you are a large shipper, a shipper of large packages that have additional handling weight or dimensions or even oversized packages, and your rates are going up 20% on those surcharges, you're going to be very surprised when you see your annual increase, instead of being 5.9, more like 10 or 12 or even higher. And what the carriers are doing here is very clearly telling the market that they don't necessarily want those big, heavy, bulky packages in their network. It's costly to move them. It takes up space in trucks. And so by assessing these large surcharges to those, they're essentially telling you, we don't want them. And if we're going to handle them, you're going to pay for it.
Bonnie, could you talk about the impact of some of the zonal changes that have happened over the last few years?
Absolutely. And I think what we're seeing, particularly with the AHS fees and the large package fees, is that it is, again, to Paul's point, it's punitive, but it's particularly punitive the farther you go. So what they've basically done is they know both the FedEx and UPS know they have more competition regionally, zones 2, 3, and 4, essentially, 5, 2 for that matter. And so they're going to be less aggressive on the rate increases there, but they're going to charge you more on these fees for zones 6, 7, and 8 to keep them out of their network. Generally, as Paul's point was, but also they know you have to ship with them if you're going to go zones 6, 7, and 8 because they're the only ones who can get to those zones. And so they're going to make you pay for it when they do. And this is one of those things where understanding your package mix is key. How much volume do you have to certain zones? How big are your packages? Is there going to be a change in your packages? Are they going to get bigger because of something different that you're doing? And now you're suddenly going to have an impact from one of these fees that you currently don't. Another one that always drives me nuts is the address correction fee. You see it at the end there. They have an address checker function in all of their software, whether it's UPS World Ship or FedEx Ship Manager. You use that and you still can potentially get hit with an address correction fee, despite the fact that they checked it for you and told you it was a good address. So that one is particularly grating. I think probably everyone on this call has certain addresses they're shipping to that are constantly impacted by an address correction fee because of something unique to the recipient you're shipping to.
Thanks. Yeah. Now, over the years, over the last few years especially, we've seen as these surcharges have gone up, not only have the surcharges themselves gone up, but UPS and FedEx have introduced new surcharges as well, right? And what that does, and those things have incredible yield because nobody has a discount on them yet. So everybody pays the published rate, almost everybody. Very few people have a cap set up ahead of time. But for a certain amount of time, everybody's paying 100% of that assessed charge, right? For things like additional handling, they introduced, peak surcharge and then turned it into a demand surcharge. And for large package, UPS and FedEx are now charging $40 for that one on top of the base surcharge that went up over 20% and is something like $160 or more. And then on top of that, you've got fuel surcharge adding in, right? We talked before about how fuel is also going up. We'll talk about that in a future slide here in a second. But all of this stuff really snowballs. So we've seen plenty of our clients who come to us having, maybe 25% of the average cost per piece that they were paying 4 years ago was made up of surcharges. But now in 2024, that might make up a full half of the overall amount that they pay. So be very cognizant of these because they are a bigger and bigger percentage of what many shippers pay, and they are not subject to that 5.9.
And one of the things I think you probably want to mention here too, Paul, you might have been about to say regarding the DAS fees, they change how they apply them. They change where they apply them to. So certain zip codes 1 year, and typically it's maybe different zip codes the next year, and more than likely they're not going to subtract zip codes they hit you with these fees on. They're going to add to them. So these are ones you really want to watch out for. And also you want to watch out if your package profile is changing and you have reductions for commercial locations for DAS shipments, but you're going to suddenly start shipping more to residential locations. You want to make sure you have a reduction in place. If you don't, you're going to be surprised by that fee.
Yeah, good point. The carriers do add and subtract zip codes to, what qualifies for DAS or extended delivery area surcharge every year. And sometimes it looks, pretty equal what gets added and what gets subtracted until you look at the population within those zip codes. And you find that they're taking out some very low population zip codes and replacing them with much higher population zip codes. So a higher and higher percentage of your packages, even if you have the same distribution, might be eligible for these charges. It's a very difficult increase to identify. If you're looking at your shipping and wondering, why is it going up so much? That's a really hard one to catch.
I think the bigger, broader point there, Josh, is you don't know about it until you've already been billed for it. That's right. Usually when you find out. You see it on an invoice a month after it's happened.
Right. Doing some sort of GRI analysis on your own to figure out how much it's going to impact you so you can actually budget for it. That's a pretty complex process to do. There aren't a whole lot of people who don't have a background with one of the carriers that are capable or could do that very easily. There are very smart people out there who can, certainly, but it's a complex process. Let's move on to the next slide here. So these are some examples from our client base, kind of ranges as your distribution might be impacted differently than somebody else's, right? The average weight, the average zone, the service that you use, who you ship to, all of that can be impacted differently. You don't have just a set 5.9% increase across every weight and zone combination, right? So this is a typical range that we've found among our clients as we've done GRI analyses for them. UPS on the base rates, we're seeing between 5.8 and 7.1 on average. And this is worth discussing, right? 5.8 is below the 5.9% announced GRI, which, I think most people would be happy about, like, if you can be happy about a 5.9% annual increase, 5.8. But again, it just comes down to your distribution. If your shipping, hits those cells that aren't going up quite as much, you don't actually pay as much as everybody else. On the high end, we're looking at about 7.1%. So on the surcharges, though, we're looking at an average of between 7.7 and 12.2. So somebody who's shipping a lot of additional handling, large package surcharge, they would, be up here in the upper range. Somebody who had fairly small, dense commercial shipping is going to be more along these lines. Similarly to FedEx, and this was an interesting trend we saw coming in. We had some coming in a little bit lower and then ending up a little bit higher than UPS. And again, this is just differences in distribution. But same on the surcharges, 6.9 on the lower end and 12.6 on the upper end. So, you're likely to fall somewhere within these ranges or very similar, just based on your distribution. Anything you want to add, guys, before we go on?
I would just add a little bit here that I can sense perhaps some of the audience being confused. How could we be lower than a 5.9% increase when the overall increase starts at 5.9? And it's quite simple. Like Josh said, it depends on your mix. So, for example, if you look at that FedEx shipper or the FedEx low of 5.5, and you look at this chart here, if you are a heavy ground shipper, and then your only version of express shipping perhaps is Express Saver, where you're talking about an increase of 4.4 overall for Express Saver and 5.9 on the ground, or even second day at 5.49, those are coming in lower than the average overall announcement of 5.9. So if anyone was confused how you could come in below, it could be a shipper that has those characteristics, heavy ground, and then your only express shipping could be the second day and Express Saver, especially lightweight and close zones.
Yeah, thanks for walking us through that. The next one we have here is about fuel. Now, this is just to dispel a general misunderstanding, right? Fuel surcharge is named to create a psychological anchor in our mind that, hey, this is just kind of a pass through to pay for what the carriers are paying for fuel, right? They're passing it along, cover their costs, moving on. But really, it's a profit center. And it's important to understand this if you're going to negotiate the best possible rates for yourself. This chart is pretty simple, but if you go back to March of 2019 and you look at the table, the way the table is set up, right? The table gives you a range for the price of a gallon of fuel, and then it gives you a corresponding percentage that you'll pay on the fuel surcharge. And fuel surcharge is charged on not just the base rate, but also a lot of the other surcharges and accessorials as well. So additional handling, large package surcharge, delivery area surcharge, residential delivery charge, signature services, it's added on top of everything. So when we think about, this is the line from January of 2024. If you think about what happened between 2019 and 2024, the rates went up at an incredible clip, right? So all your base rates and surcharges went up significantly. So you're paying a percentage of a much larger number already. Even if the price of fuel stayed the same, you would still be paying more for fuel surcharge because the base off of which it's calculated has increased. But in addition to that, the carriers have also increased the tables. So, for if we're looking at these different divisions here, so if fuel is starting at $2.92, right? You would have paid 6.5% in March of 2019, but in January of this year, you're paying 12.5%. And when you start applying this, I looked at one that was, I think, May 2020 versus May 2022. And just in that 2-year time span, if you have a basic package, say you paid $10 for it in 2020, the fuel surcharge would have bought a quarter of a gallon of gas in whatever rate it was. 2 years later, you would have bought half a gallon of gas for that same package, even though the carriers have gotten more fuel efficient, right? That package doesn't require an extra quarter of a gallon to get from A to B. They're just charging you more money for it. So it's important to understand how this can really increase your costs over time. All right, so looking out into 2024, what does all of this mean for us? Paul, I'm going to start with you. We mentioned earlier that there is a lot of capacity in the system. How does that change the way the carriers are looking at things?
Thanks, Josh. So, you think about what was happening at around the same time that the GRI was announced in the fall. UPS was coming off of what turned out to be a fairly costly labor negotiation with the Teamsters. And as a result of that negotiation that took place over the course of several months, they were losing a little bit of volume to FedEx, to the USPS, to regional carriers. And then coupled with that, losing volume that UPS was losing volume, coupled with that was overall volumes in the market coming down. So what we're seeing now as a result, coming out of that negotiation, coming out of peak season here, is we're seeing ample capacity in the market, really for all the carriers, which is translating into the carriers coming out with some very aggressive pricing. UPS, shortly after their negotiation with the Teamsters, started releasing some really aggressive pricing to try to win back volume from FedEx and the USPS. And then as a result, FedEx countered, and as a result, so did the regionals. So right now we're seeing super aggressive pricing from all of the carriers because they are trying to maintain as much volume as they can, again, because there's ample capacity in the network.
Right. Yeah. We've seen some pretty great rates, like you said. It's been a good time to renegotiate, especially after so many years in a row during COVID when the carriers really had all the power. So it's kind of swinging back a bit toward the shipper, which is great to see. At the same time, they've raised the rates so much that there is quite a bit of room there for them to negotiate down. I think one of the unfortunate byproducts of that is that as mentioned earlier, that gap between what UPS and FedEx charge versus what regionals and others charge, as that narrows, it reduces the incentive for shippers to maybe take a risk and try another carrier. There are complications involved with that, just operationally, and the technology and everything required to do that. Just the time spent with the carriers, it just reduces the incentive for them to do that. And I hope it doesn't reduce it entirely, because there are some very good carriers out there that I think people could really come to appreciate if they gave them a try.
And Josh, there's another thing I'd like to point out about, along with that aggressive pricing that we're seeing, we're also seeing the carriers being more aggressive with commitment language and termination language in agreements, more so than ever before. And that's their way of protecting the volume that they have and protecting the volume that they're winning. So it's super important to note that while there is some pretty aggressive pricing that's out in the market, you still really need to understand what the agreements are looking like, instead of just taking the carrier's word for that, this is a good agreement and you should sign this and you're going to save X% by signing this agreement. It's really important that you understand what that pricing looks like. So to do that, you really have to understand what your specific data looks like. But again, just be super careful about the insertion of commitment and termination language, because that can become very penal very quickly.
Good point. That kind of goes back to some of those surcharges, right? Like the fact that those surcharges go up so dramatically every year, that's an invitation to renegotiate. Not that the carriers are going to be happy about it when you tell them you want to renegotiate, but if you've given up that right in your contract, then you're just stuck with those. And while it's true that there are some caps on surcharges out there, they're not very common. And in any negotiation, it comes down to what am I going to give up in exchange for what I'm getting? And that becomes a really complicated calculation sometimes. There's uncertainty about what's going to happen, what the carriers are going to do. So you're never quite sure how it's going to stack up against another discount. But technically, anything's possible. They have the ability to give you pretty much any discount you can ask for. But there's going to be something that you give up in exchange. And so understanding exactly what your needs are, exactly what commitments you can agree to, and where the source of cost is coming from and how you can address it, it's a very important thing to understand very well.
The language thing is key too. We've seen it. They'll give you a concession on one hand and take it away on another. We've seen them insert inflationary language into the agreements to basically protect them from other concessions they've given, and you don't even notice. And if you aren't careful, you think you're getting, in this case, a rate increase concession, but you don't get it because they've got inflationary language in there that cancels it out.
Right. Yeah, they're very good at protecting themselves, and it makes sense. Everybody's in business to make money, but hopefully you can strike a deal that is good for both parties. I mean, that's really the goal. All right. Audie, we talk in our team all the time about things like this, but basically if the carriers can isolate one characteristic, they can turn it into a surcharge, right? So there are plenty of opportunities out there that haven't been monetized yet by the carriers. Do you see anything coming down the pike, or what might be some of the big changes that affect a lot of people?
I think the things that jump out to us are really what the past is prologue here, right? We've seen when they first implemented the fuel surcharge way back when, in the early aughts, they said it was going to be temporary. It's permanent. You just saw the previous chart where it not only is it permanent, but it's a profit center for them. They're not just trying to recoup their spend, they're trying to charge you for it. We saw them with demand surcharges. They're called demand surcharges now, but they were peak surcharges because they were supposed to be specific to peak season. Now they're demand surcharges so that they can implement them throughout the year. That's why they changed the name. One of the things we're concerned about around surcharges more broadly is something around this idea of dynamic pricing. And one of the things we see that in sports, if the Yankees are playing the Dodgers, you might be able to charge more for that ticket than if they're playing the Pirates. And that's the kind of thing we see, and we're concerned about them doing that. And if they do implement something like that, then the question is, are they going to give you reductions, or is it just going to be they're going to charge you more when they're busier? And how are they going to determine that? Please see, again, the demand surcharge. Those are some of the things that we're very concerned about here on our end. Right now, there is, as Paul's mentioned, there's more capacity. There should be an opportunity to negotiate here. But that doesn't mean they're not going to try and implement things. And what we've seen with the carriers, when they implement a surcharge and an increase, they don't go back. That increase stays in place, that new surcharge stays in place.
Yeah, I totally agree. We can't close without talking a little bit about Amazon shipping, right? Last year, 2023, was the first time that Amazon delivered more packages than UPS. And it's probably even more dramatic than the basic numbers that you've seen. For example, UPS includes the SurePost packages that they carry that are delivered by the post office as packages that they've delivered, whereas Amazon does not count a package if they hand it off to a secondary carrier like UPS or the USPS. So that gulf is already widening just with their products. And they're forecasted to deliver more packages than UPS and FedEx combined very shortly. Now, last year, they reintroduced a more general service that they had shortly in the market before COVID. Audie, I know you've had a couple opportunities to look into this. Can you give us some insight on what's going on there?
Yeah, and I think this is something that we all have to be paying a lot of attention to. And in the case of the Shipware clients Josh referenced, we have two, one that was particularly large and one that was a medium-sized customer. They were both approached by Amazon. They did not seek out Amazon or try and approach them. And the reason that happened was because their location and their package profile was a good fit for Amazon. So what we're already seeing is Amazon is picking and choosing what's best for them, which is absolutely the right way for them to go. The other thing we're seeing Amazon do is be extremely aggressive. These pricing programs were similar in that they really restricted the number of surcharges that were initially going to apply. You were going to get a pretty aggressive rate, pretty aggressive discounts. They also had spend categories. So like FedEx and UPS, where you're required to spend a certain amount to get a portion of your discount, Amazon implemented that as well. So to make sure that they were going to get a certain amount of volume. But they, again, and I emphasize this, they restricted most surcharges. And the ones that were in place, they gave heavy discounts on. So this was really an aggressive attempt to try and capture business. And it's something we would encourage everybody to look at. If they're coming to you and talking to you, that's something you want to have that conversation.
Also of note, when Amazon did this, they talked about it being a slow launch, taking upwards of 3, 4, 5 years before they were really up and running full steam. But based on the aggressive approach that we've seen, you could speculate that it's going to be, a little bit faster than that, 5-year plan to get fully launched. I think, one of the things that is holding them back a little bit right now is pickup density. But as they rectify that pickup density, I think you're going to see Amazon really becoming a major third party, a third competitor to FedEx and UPS nationally.
Right now, I think they're in 15 major metros on the pickup side, so that's really the limiting factor to their expansion. It is interesting to note, though, isn't it, that this is a basically 2 to 5 day service. So if you're like a seller fulfilled prime shipper, this isn't the service for you, right? This is a slower service comparable to FedEx or USPS Ground Advantage, but at great rates. Okay, so just a couple more things. Carrier contraction. And this is about our concern for some of the smaller shippers out there, right? As it becomes easier to stay with UPS or FedEx, it gets harder for these companies to continue their expansion. So that could become an issue, and you might see some of the smaller ones that are struggling either exiting the market or getting swallowed up by one that's slightly larger. And then finally, the dynamic pricing that Audie hit on earlier. So this could be a very exciting development. You just need to make sure that if you're single sourced, dynamic pricing, you have to be really skeptical that this is going to benefit you, right? Because in order to push your packages from a busy day to a slow day, in a true dynamic pricing environment, you'd raise the price on the busy day and you drop the price on the slow day. But if you don't have competing carriers in there that are going after the business, really all the carrier has to do is raise the rate on the busy day without dropping the rate on the slow day. So you end up losing. You either incur the cost of moving it to the slow day without getting any savings, or you're paying the higher rate on the fast day. So that's the end of our prepared remarks. What we offer to our clients is or people who are interested potentially in our business is a free assessment of your shipping. And if we think there's something that we can do to help, we give you a range of savings to see if it's worth it to you. We'll also give you free benchmarks of how you compare to similar clients in the market. And while it isn't something that we typically offer, but the GRI assessment, that's what this call has been about. So if you would like some insight into what you can expect in 2024, we would add that in as well. So I think after the webinar, you'll have some you'll have a page with some contact us if you want. If you want, great. We'd love to talk with you about that. So with that, Audie, do we have any questions from the viewers?
No, currently we don't.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about dynamic pricing then, because we kind of hurried through that one. And everybody, if you have some questions that you would like us to address, please go down to the bottom, click on click on Q&A, or is it just the chat where you click on and enter something there? So, guys, on the dynamic pricing front, this is something that does require, I think, some interesting technology, right? The ability to have a reverse auction or something along those lines. You can't really do that without a program in place. So when we think about what some of the benefits to that might be, is there a way to do this like that benefits the carrier and the shipper at the same time? It's kind of a hard question to answer, right? But really, it is promising. If you can, some of the difficulties to doing this, right? The carriers that currently have your business don't want to give it up. And this is where it kind of expands to the more general discussion, where if you're going to add in additional carriers, your existing carriers are going to want to hold you to those revenue bands and not going to want to let you go. So you have to somehow get them to agree to loosen things up and give you some adaptability.
Josh,
so Josh, my response to that would be that, it wasn't the shippers who were crying out to the carriers asking for dynamic pricing to be part of a solution. It's totally being introduced by the carriers. They talk about it often on earnings calls, and when clients have business reviews with FedEx and UPS, we hear about it through that as well. So the immediate answer is, I don't think there's any that it benefits both. The only way it possibly does benefit the shipper is if they have a very sophisticated TMS that allows them to very dynamically rate shop every shipment as it's going out. Otherwise, this is definitely to the advantage of the carriers that introduce dynamic pricing.
Josh, I'm going to jump in. We do have a couple of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and pose that to our group. The first is, are you seeing FedEx and UPS offer discounts on fuel surcharges lately? If yes, what are you typically seeing?
Yeah, this has been a development since the UPS Teamsters thing was resolved. Paul mentioned that once that happened, we started seeing UPS offer some very aggressive rates in the market. And part of that was fuel surcharge discounts to very small accounts that had never had the opportunity to get those savings in the past. So this is one that has been protected pretty closely by both carriers traditionally. And that was to me, that was one of the biggest surprises coming out of that new approach from the carriers, is their willingness to discount this fee. Guys, are you thinking the same thing? Was that your experience as well?
I think that's absolutely right, and that was the first reaction, I think, of all of us, is when UPS started offering that concession to much smaller shippers. That was a brand new change in the market. That was not something they would do. Either of them had done before. They protected fuel surcharges considerably. We have a second question, a couple actually. The next one is, if we want an evaluation of our carrier costs, what would you recommend? Should this occur before our contract is coming up?
Paul, you want to take that?
Yes, yeah, and absolutely. You should definitely have an evaluation done before your contract is coming up. Never let the carrier force you into signing an extension of your agreement without having the opportunity to review it and see what might benefit you through a very direct and targeted negotiation. And as we've talked about a few times, that the rate at which these surcharges and rates go up every year, the carriers are practically inviting you to do so.
A little background on Paul. Paul came to us from a major shipper, right? He was probably in a very similar role to what many of you have. And, coming to Shipware, he's been an incredible asset for us. We didn't have to teach him how to negotiate. He knew that already. But he relied on a third party to give him access to the data, right? Paul, could you talk a little bit about how that impacted the way you negotiated?
Sure. You're right. I did have a third party that I used to audit my bills and pay my parcel bills for me. But what it did is offer extremely detailed insight into my specific shipping profile. So I knew how many additional weights I would have annually, and I knew how many DASs I would have annually, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew exactly the areas in which I needed to be able to target those negotiations, and I knew what was going to be meaningful to me, and I knew what was a giveaway to let the carriers have. So it's really important. We can't stress it enough that it's really important that you understand your data and what your shipping profile looks like.
All right. And if you have the capability to do that on your own, awesome. If you don't, it may be cheaper than you expect. It's definitely worthwhile to have it.
Next question. FedEx excluded one rate from demand surcharges this year. Do you think they could do that again in 2024? What are your thoughts on flat rate programs such as one rate when it comes to dynamic pricing and demand surcharges?
Well, this is a fun one. Audie, with your background in FedEx, do you want to tackle that?
I think it's a fantastic question. And I think it's absolutely the right one, because that's very much where one might expect them to go. With what we see is when FedEx offers one rate, typically it's combined with less than necessarily aggressive ground pricing, because the one rate pricing is so aggressive. And so one of the challenges for shippers is how to manage both. How do you get more with ground? How do you not lose your existing one rate pricing? That's typically what happens. And how do you limit rate increases on one rate? For FedEx, from their point of view, one rate was always a challenge because to some degree it's a bit of a loss leader. They're trying to attract volume into services that are not being used as much, typically two-day and express saver. And so that for them, that's a challenge. And so dynamic pricing would potentially help them solve some of the negative margin volume they get in their one rate program. So I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if we started seeing them apply dynamic pricing, or more likely demand surcharges to one rate. Because again, one rate is something now, it's an air service being used a lot of the times during their peak shipping season. And so that's not necessarily something where they want to give you massive discounts.
Right. As a shipper tends to get larger and larger and have better capabilities, those flat rate programs, the value of them tends to shrink, right? The real value comes from smaller companies or mid-sized companies that need the simplicity and the savings. So I hope they don't, but it's certainly a realistic possibility because they're already running so much cheaper than some of the comparable services.
Next question.
Okay.
Is it better to ask for a GRI cap or for further discount improvement? Or does it depend on the shipper? Only if... So then that, I think that is the right question.
It is absolutely right. And just really quickly on this, it does kind of depend on what your distribution looks like. If you're heavy on the surcharges, you might want to reserve the right to renegotiate that every year just because of how aggressively some of these things are increasing. But it's definitely nice to have some of your bases covered with a cap. Again, if you lose the right to renegotiate as a result of getting that cap, that might be hurting you more than it's helping you. And I know we have two more questions here real quick.
Yep. Do you feel that there's a parcel dollar volume minimum to have impactful negotiating power in this market? I realize we can always negotiate some things, but to really engage in this competitive negotiation you were talking about, most of what I've been reading directs the true needle moving negotiating power towards $1 million and up.
So very quickly on this, the rates that are available to smaller shippers through online partners of, say, UPS, like the DAP program, the rates you could get through using ShipStation or Shopify or on Amazon, those have become more and more aggressive over time. And they can provide a lot of savings for the right distribution. And the carriers are going more toward standardizing the rates that smaller shippers pay, especially sub 500,000 a year. But once you hit about 500,000 a year, I think you should be able to get the attention of somebody at the carriers and have them take a look at your individual distribution and see if one of those programs is better for you or if you can do better on your own. So, any discussion on that?
No, I don't. Next question we've got is more of a comment, which is, with a growing e-commerce environment, it's just odd that they would not capitalize on these. And I believe that by these are referring to the previous one rate and dynamic pricing, demand surcharges, et cetera, that we talked about.
Right. As Audie said, these are kind of loss leaders. I think the margins on those shipments aren't great for the carriers. You see UPS not really aggressively following FedEx onto the one rate side. They do have a version of it, but it's very infrequent that somebody gets offered those rates. And that's the reason. It's a low margin thing for them. So if FedEx can use it to win your business away from UPS, I think you've got a great chance of getting a good rate. But even they have been a little less likely to offer those recently than they would a few years ago. And then the last one here, I pulled it up as well. Are GSRs worth it, or should you ask for deeper discounts? Is one carrier better than the other for GSRs? Since COVID, both carriers, they initially cut it off for everything. Now it's back in place for one-day services. It's nowhere near as valuable as it used to be. So if you could get, an extra % savings, an extra % discount on your ground as a result of giving up the inability to currently file those, great. That's good for you. I think in the future, I would expect this to become kind of a negotiable, right? I mean, it is something that UPS and FedEx can turn on and off, and it might be a way for them to differentiate themselves versus the competition by offering it or offering you something in exchange for waiving it. But anything's possible. Quantifying it is the real trick, and making sure that what you're giving away is at least as valuable, or no more valuable than what you're getting in exchange for it. So thanks, everybody. We appreciate you attending today. I know we went over by a few minutes, but please reach out for us if you have any additional questions. You're not obligated to pay us just for reaching out for us and asking for an assessment. We'd be happy to take a look and give you a feel for where you're at. So for Paul and Audie and I, thanks again. See you later.